As far as you're concerned, did you personally suffer from discrimination as a child? Did it recently happen to you despite your social status?
Yes. So as your colleague mentioned, I was born in 1954. I'm from Columbia, South Carolina. Columbia, South Carolina is in what is called in the United States the Deep South. South Carolina was one of the Confederate states. It's one of the states that seceded from the United States. In fact, the Civil War began in South Carolina. And my parents were refugees from racial oppression in South Carolina. They left with me when I was quite young. I was 3 or 4 years old. But I used to go back to South Carolina quite often. And I used to spend summers there. And I very vividly remember in 1963 and in 1964, when I would go back to Columbia, South Carolina, the public parks were all closed in South Carolina because courts had ordered that those parks be desegregated. Prior to then, you had certain parks that were set aside for whites, certain parks that were set aside for blacks. And the courts system said you cannot do that anymore. So instead of allowing people to go to whatever park they wanted to go to, the authorities in South Carolina closed all the parks. I remember that very well. I also remember going to movie films in South Carolina. The one that's most vivid in my mind is going to see the movie The Nutty Professor. So I went to see The Nutty Professor with a cousin of mine, and we went to see The Nutty Professor. The big theater, the white people went in the front of the theater, the colored people went in the side of the theater. The white people sat on the first floor. The black people sat in the balcony. But it's a funny thing. I saw all of this through the eyes of a 9-year-old or 8, 9, 10-year-old. And I did not, at that point, experience it as a type of oppression. In fact, I thought it was a benefit being in the balcony because when the lights would go down, the youngsters would throw candy. And so the black youngsters were in a much better position because we were up top and we would throw candy on the people below, and it was much more difficult for the people below to throw candy on us. But as I grew older, I did see the ugly side of racial oppression. So for instance, when my father would drive us to the South, my mother would always pack sandwiches and beverages, sodas, so that we wouldn't have to stop, because if we would have to stop, we would suffer racial oppression, or it was just very uncomfortable. So we would take whatever we were going to eat or what we were going to drink, we would just have to keep in the car with us so that we wouldn't have to interact with white people, frankly. And so growing up, I saw racial oppression. I saw my father would often be pulled over when we would drive in the Deep South, because the car that my father would have a Washington, D.C. license plate on it. And there would be police officers who would pull us over. He was doing nothing wrong, but they would pull us over. And the officer would say, "I see that you have a Washington, D.C. license plate." And my father would say, "Yes, sir, that's true." And the officer would say, "Well, we do things differently down here. You do know that, right?" And my father would say, "Yes, sir." And the police officer would let us go. But it was, it was very, it created a lot of nervousness. And I was very aware that black people were being oppressed. Not only in the Deep South. It's a mistake to think the racial oppression in the United States was most obvious in the Deep South. They had signs up, colored people go to the bathroom over here, or white people go to the bathroom over here. But throughout the United States, in the North, in the West, all through the United States, there has been racial oppression.